Hey everyone, this is Unit 3, Lesson 5, and today's lesson is looking at the religious practices in ancient Egypt. So, in the last couple of lessons, you've learned about how Pharaoh was considered a god and how priests and religion were extremely important in the daily lives of the people. So, now you're going to get a chance to learn about the religion that the ancient Egyptians actually practiced. So, the Egyptians were polytheistic. So, just like the Mesopotamians, the ancient Egyptians were polytheistic, or they believed in multiple gods. They believed that their gods could control all things. So, this was everything in the natural world, so things like the weather, everything in the daily life in the human world, and then everything in the spiritual world. They believed that they had to make sure that the gods were happy so that the good things would happen. Otherwise, they believed that the bad things happened because the gods were unhappy. In the Egyptian religion, there were around 2,000 gods and goddesses. That's a lot. So let's learn about some of the main ones. So Ra, which is this one over here, was the sun god. Ra typically is seen as the most important, and it was believed that he created all forms of life. Isis was the mother goddess. She was a protector and a helper to those in need. Osiris was the ruler of the underworld. Anubis was the god of the dead. He focused primarily on mummification in the afterlife, and he also helped lost souls in ushering people through the underworld or through the afterlife to get to the spirit world. And then Horus was the god of the sky. So the ancient Egyptians built temples as houses for the gods. It was believed that the gods would live in these temples and that when they were living there, they would need to be taken care of. So this is where a lot of the rituals and ceremonies took place for the gods and goddesses, and priests and priestesses would work in the temples to make sure everything was run correctly, and all of the ceremonies were held how they should have been. So this picture here is the Temple of Edfu, but it was a temple for Horus and Hathor. So, since we talked about gods controlling the underworld and afterlife, let's talk about the afterlife. So the Egyptians believed in an afterlife, or a life that continued after death. They saw death as only part of a cycle, and that there was life after death that was going to be happy and prosperous. They believed life in the next world would be better than life on earth. They strongly believed that in order to get to the underworld and to have a good afterlife, a person had to be good in this life. Their good deeds would measure whether or not they had a happy afterlife. So the underworld and its trials. The Egyptians believed that in order to get to the spirit world and have an afterlife, the souls of the dead had to go through the underworld, and that the underworld was full of trials and challenges to judge a person to see if they were good enough to go on to that next life and go on to the spirit world. So, in the underworld, the spirit faced physical dangers like creatures that actually wanted to eat their souls. They also had actual trials and judgments, so physical trials like a court trial, to see if they had broken rules in the living world. And the very last thing, if they made it through all these other challenges, was to have their heart weighed, to see if their good deeds were enough to let them have an afterlife. So their heart was weighed against a feather, known as the feather of truth. If the heart was heavier than the feather because of their wrongdoings, then their heart would be eaten by a monster. If it was not heavier than the feather, then the spirit would be allowed to have an afterlife and go on to the spirit world. So the Egyptians had a manual that they could purchase that would help them navigate their way through the underworld. It contained clues, maps, shortcuts, and protection spells that allowed them to pass safely through all of those different challenges in order to get to the spirit world and to have a good afterlife. This became known as the Book of the Dead. They were specific for each person, and again, they were purchased so people who could afford them could purchase a Book of the Dead to help them in the afterlife. So let's talk about mummies. So, the people believed that if they were granted an afterlife, then their soul would come back to their body to live in the spirit world. So, in order for this to happen, the person's body needed to be preserved so that the spirit be able to come back. They would embalm the bodies or treat the body with different preservatives to prevent it from decaying. So the Egyptians went through a very elaborate process to preserve the body to keep it from decaying. They had to remove the body's organs and liquids so that there would be no moisture. They removed all organs and things except for the heart, because remember, they needed the heart to be weighed in the afterlife. And then they went through many steps to dry out, preserve, and protect and wrap the body so it would be ready for the afterlife if the spirit could return. So the total process could take up to 40 days to complete. But this made mummies. The whole process that we just mentioned made mummies, or a body that is preserved so it won't decay. The organs were also saved. They were put into canopic jars. These are special jars that were supposed to protect the organs, just in case they were needed in the afterlife. And then the mummy was placed in a sarcophagus, or a large coffin, and these coffins often had images that were carved onto them of the person's life or who they were. And then a death or burial mask was often placed over the face or the head of the dead so that the spirit would recognize its body when it returned. So here's just some images of that. Here is a coffin within a sarcophagus, multiple sarcophagi here. These are canopic jars. These are examples of the burial masks. And then here's some examples of what a sarcophagus might look like. With the different images. This one is a little more specific with personalized things to the person. So at first, Egyptians believed that only the pharaohs and select people could enjoy the afterlife. So in the beginning, only pharaohs and nobles became mummies. Eventually, they believed everyone could enjoy the afterlife. However, the embalming process was really expensive. So the average person really didn't go through the mummification process. It was only the people who could afford it. So we have mummies and we have their coffins, but where did they put them? They put them in tombs. So there were different types of tombs that were used throughout Egypt and throughout the different Old, Middle, and New kingdoms. So we know in the Old Kingdom is the age of the pyramids. So that's where the pharaohs' tombs were during that time. In the Middle Kingdom, a lot of the pharaohs' tombs are going to be carved into caves or in the ground in order to be protected, because one of the problems with the pyramids was grave robbers and things. So they wanted to protect the pharaohs' bodies for the afterlife, so they ended up putting them in caves or hiding the tombs in the ground. And then they also, within the New Kingdom, that is when we get things like the Valley of the Kings or specific temples. So actual elaborate buildings carved for these pharaohs to be buried, or a giant, the Valley of the Kings is in the ground, but they're giant elaborate tombs as well. So here is an example of the inside of one of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. But for the everyday person, some could afford nice burials or some could afford these elaborate tombs. But the average person was just buried in the ground. So the Egyptians also believed that they needed items to enjoy and use in their afterlife. So often different things were put in their tombs. And this included favorite items from the person's life, small statues, gifts, artwork, and sometimes the mummies of deceased pets, family members, or workers were put in the tombs as well. So this is just showing you the inside of some of the tombs. You can see all of the gold and furniture and chariots and different things ready to go for the person to enjoy in their afterlife. So just to recap, religion was an important part of the Egyptians' everyday life. They worshipped many gods and goddesses who controlled all things. They created temples as houses for the gods, and that's where they were worshipped. They believed in an afterlife and believed in order to get to the afterlife, they had to be good in this one. Mummies were made to preserve the bodies for the afterlife. Not everyone became a mummy, only those who could afford it. And Pharaoh and the rich often had elaborate tombs to help them in the afterlife.